The wooden gavel struck the bench with a sharp crack, silencing the quiet murmurs that had filled the courtroom. All eyes turned to the judge, an older man with piercing eyes and a face hardened by years of delivering verdicts. His lips curled into a smirk as he leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, surveying the young man standing alone at the defendant's table. Noah's hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the polished wood. His heart pounded so loudly he swore the whole room could hear it. The air was thick with judgment, and the weight of the moment pressed heavily on his shoulders. "You," the judge scoffed, his voice dripping with amusement. "You think you can represent yourself?" He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "This is a serious courtroom, young man, not a school debate club." Laughter erupted across the room. Lawyers exchanged smirks, journalists scribbled notes, and even members of the jury exchanged amused glances. The courtroom, a place meant for justice, now felt like an arena where a boy was being thrown to the wolves. Noah lowered his gaze, his face burning hot. He had expected skepticism, doubt even. But the sheer mockery, the way they laughed as if he were nothing more than a foolish child playing dress-up, was worse than he had imagined. The judge adjusted his robe, still smirking. "This is a waste of the court's time," he said dismissively. "What could you possibly know about the law? You look like you just stepped out of a library." Another wave of laughter rippled through the crowd. Noah felt it then, the pressure, the weight of every set of eyes on him, waiting for him to crumble. He had spent his life avoiding attention, blending into the background. But today, he didn't have that choice. Today, he had to stand. He inhaled slowly, steadying his breath, and then he did something no one expected. He lifted his head. His eyes locked onto the judge's with quiet defiance, and then, with a voice steadier than even he had anticipated, he spoke. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, each word crisp and unwavering. "The law's meant to protect everyone, not just those who can afford a lawyer." The room fell into stunned silence. The judge's smirk vanished. The laughter ceased. The journalists stopped writing. The jury members sat up straighter. Even the prosecutor, who had been watching with an amused expression, now eyed Noah with a flicker of something else. Curiosity. Noah's hands were no longer shaking. His pulse still raced, but this time, it wasn't fear that fueled it. This was his moment. The battle had begun. 2 weeks earlier, Noah's world was much simpler. He was just another high school student, quiet, reserved, the kind of kid who buried himself in books while others were out living their teenage years. But while most of his classmates lost themselves in fantasy novels or comic books, Noah had a different obsession: law. He wasn't studying it because he had to. He studied it because it fascinated him. The structure, precision, the way a few words could decide a person's fate. He would spend hours at the library, flipping through legal texts, memorizing cases, dissecting arguments like a puzzle only he could solve. But back then, it was just a hobby, just something to keep his mind busy, until Jake Parker, Noah's best friend since childhood, the kind of friend who never judged him for being the quiet one, the bookworm, the kid who preferred reading over football games. And now, Jake was in trouble. Accused of theft. A local electronics store had been robbed, and somehow all fingers pointed to Jake. The evidence was flimsy at best, but the store owner was well connected, and the police didn't seem too interested in asking questions. The court assigned a defense attorney, but it was clear Jake was just another name on a long list, another case to process. No one cared enough to fight for him. Late one night, as Noah sat at Jake's house flipping through a book, he overheard voices drifting from the next room. Jake's mother, her voice thick with worry. "I don't know what to do. We can't afford a real lawyer. If they convict him..." Her voice cracked. He'll go to jail for something he didn't do. A heavy silence followed. Noah sat frozen, gripping the edges of his book, and in that moment, something inside him shifted. This wasn't just another case in a textbook. This was real. This was Jake's life. The next morning, Noah walked into Jake's house, a folder clutched tightly in his hands. His heart pounded as he looked at Jake and his parents, who stared at him with exhausted, hopeless eyes. "I'm going to defend him," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Jake's father frowned. "Noah, that's not how this works. You're a kid. You can't just—" "I know," Noah admitted, his grip tightening around the folder. "But I also know the law allows people to represent themselves. If Jake agrees, I can stand up for him. I've studied every case like this in the last 10 years. I think I can prove he's innocent." Jake looked up, his expression a mix of hope and fear. "Are you sure about this?" Noah hesitated for only a second. "Yes." And from that moment, there was no turning back. The next 2 weeks were a blur of research, late-night study sessions, and relentless preparation. Noah devoured law books, dissected courtroom procedures, and examined every scrap of evidence like a detective piecing together a mystery. He watched the security footage from the electronics store 100 times, scribbling notes, analyzing every frame. He tracked down witnesses, cross-referenced reports, and built a timeline proving Jake wasn't even near the crime scene when the robbery happened. But as the trial date loomed closer, doubt crept in. What if he failed? What if he made a fool of himself? What if Jake ended up behind bars because Noah had been too arrogant to realize he wasn't ready? One night, sitting alone in his dimly lit room, surrounded by stacks of books and legal documents, he buried his face in his hands. His whole life, he had been the quiet one, the observer, the kid in the background. But this time, he couldn't afford to disappear. This time, he had to fight. And so, with nothing but determination and the weight of his best friend's future on his shoulders, he stepped into the courtroom, ready to take on a system designed to crush people like him. He didn't know if he would win, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving without a fight. The courtroom was still, the weight of judgment heavy in the air. The judge let out a sigh, clearly unimpressed, as he adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. His gaze locked onto Noah, and for a moment it seemed as if he was going to dismiss him entirely. Then after a long pause, he waved a hand. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with skepticism. "Proceed." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The journalists scribbled furiously. The audience leaned forward, and the prosecutor, an older man with slicked back hair and a smug expression, couldn't help but smirk. Noah knew that look. It was the look of someone who had already decided the outcome before the first argument had even been made. The prosecutor took his time standing up, straightening his suit as he turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice smooth, confident, calculated. "Let's not waste time here. We have crystal clear evidence that places the defendant at the crime scene. This is an open and shut case." Noah swallowed, keeping his face neutral. He couldn't let them see his nerves. The prosecutor turned toward him now, his smirk widening. "You're in over your head, son," he said quietly, just loud enough for Noah to hear. "This isn't a high school debate." Noah lifted his chin. "Then let's talk about your evidence." The prosecutor's smirk faltered, just slightly. Noah turned toward the jury, speaking with a calm authority he barely recognized in himself. "The prosecution claims that Jake was caught on security footage inside the store at 8:45 p.m., he said, pacing slowly, letting the weight of his words settle. "However, there's a serious problem with that evidence." The audience shifted. The jury members sat up a little straighter. Even the judge, who had been ready to dismiss him minutes ago, raised an eyebrow. Noah walked over to the evidence table and picked up a printed still from the security footage. He held it up for the room to see. "This," he said, turning it toward the jury, "is the best image they have of the suspect." Silence. The grainy black and white image showed a person in a hooded sweatshirt, their face obscured by shadows. The resolution was poor, the details blurred beyond recognition. Noah let the jury absorb it before continuing. "Now, the prosecution wants you to believe that this is Jake Parker, that this image proves his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." He turned to the prosecutor, tilting his head. "Tell me, sir, how can you be certain this is Jake when the suspect's face isn't even visible?" A murmur swept through the courtroom. The prosecutor's smirk tightened. He cleared his throat and stepped forward, shaking his head. "The defendant was found wearing a similar hoodie just hours after the crime," he countered. "That's enough to suggest it was him." Noah let the words hang in the air for a moment before responding. "With all due respect," he said, his voice steady, "wearing the same hoodie doesn't prove anything. If it did, then anyone in this courtroom with a navy blue jacket could be a suspect. Assumption, not presenting evidence." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge leaned back, rubbing his chin, clearly more interested than before. Noah felt the shift. He had been underestimated from the moment he stepped into this courtroom, but now? Now, they were listening, and this was just the beginning. Noah didn't let the momentum slip. He could feel the shift in the air, the way the jury now watched him instead of dismissing him. The judge, who had mocked him minutes ago, was leaning slightly forward, intrigued. Even the prosecutor had stopped smirking. But Noah knew better than to celebrate too soon. He had to keep pressing forward. He took a slow breath and turned toward the witness stand. "Your Honor, I'd like to call my first witness to the stand, Mrs. Evelyn Thompson." A soft murmur spread through the courtroom as the back door opened. Mrs. Thompson, a woman in her late 50s with warm yet serious eyes, walked in with the quiet dignity of someone who had nothing to prove, only the truth to tell. She adjusted her apron slightly, as if she had been pulled from her diner mid-shift, and took a seat at the witness stand. After she was sworn in, Noah approached with confidence. "Mrs. Thompson," he began, keeping his voice calm, steady, "where were you on the night of the robbery?" She adjusted her glasses. "I was working my shift at the diner, like I always do." Noah nodded. "Do you remember seeing Jake Parker that night?" She hesitated only for a moment before answering. "Yes, he came in around 8:30 p.m. with some friends, ordered a burger and fries." Noah glanced at the jury, letting them absorb that detail. "And how long did he stay?" She pursed her lips, thinking back. "At least an hour, maybe more. I remember because they were joking around and I had to remind them to keep it down a couple of times." Noah turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the prosecution claims Jake was robbing an electronics store at 8:45 p.m. He walked over to the evidence table, picking up a piece of paper and holding it up. "But this is a time-stamped receipt from Mrs. Thompson's diner, showing that Jake paid for his meal at exactly 8:57 p.m. Gasps filled the courtroom. The jurors exchanged looks. The audience murmured. Even the judge looked momentarily surprised. Noah turned back to Mrs. Thompson. "Would you say this accurately reflects the time Jake left the diner?" She nodded. "Yes, he and his friends were there the whole time." Noah set the receipt down with care. "Then, I asked the court, how could Jake have been in two places at once?" For the first time, the prosecutor's confident posture stiffened. He shifted, gripping his pen a little tighter. The judge leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "Well, now," he muttered, rubbing his chin. That does complicate things. Noah's heart pounded in his chest. He had done it. He had cracked the prosecution's case wide open, or so he thought, because just as he felt the tide turning, the prosecutor stood, smoothing out his suit as he addressed the court. "Well, Your Honor," he said, his voice calm, deliberate, "since the defense is so intent on proving alibis, I think it's time we present a witness of our own." Noah's stomach twisted. The prosecutor turned toward the back of the courtroom, where the doors swung open once again. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark uniform, a police officer. The prosecutor's smirk returned. "I'd like to call Officer Reynolds to the stand," he announced. And just like that, the courtroom tensed again. The courtroom doors creaked open, and Officer Reynolds stepped inside. His presence alone commanded attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, the kind of man who had spent years in uniform and knew how to own a room without saying a word. His sharp blue eyes scanned the courtroom before settling on the prosecutor, who motioned for him to take the stand. Noah remained perfectly still, though his mind was racing. He knew what this was, an attempt to regain control of the case. The prosecution had been caught off guard by the alibi, and now they were scrambling to hit back. Reynolds was sworn in, his expression neutral as he settled into the witness chair. The prosecutor strode forward, confidence restored. "Officer Reynolds, you were one of the first responders to the robbery at Roberts Electronics, correct?" "Yes, sir," Reynolds answered. "And what did the store owner, Mr. Roberts, tell you when you arrived?" Reynolds folded his hands in his lap. "Mr. Roberts informed me that he saw a young man fleeing the store right after the alarm went off. He identified that young man as the defendant, Jake Parker." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. The prosecutor nodded, feigning sympathy. "And did Mr. Roberts seem unsure of what he saw?" Reynolds shook his head. "Number." He was certain. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, letting the weight of the testimony settle. "Ladies and gentlemen, a respected business owner, a man with no reason to lie, identified Jake Parker as the suspect. That alone should tell us everything we need to know." Noah clenched his jaw. The prosecutor was spinning this exactly how he expected, but Noah wasn't here to let them dictate the narrative. He stood up, adjusting his tie as he stepped toward the witness stand. "Officer Reynolds," he began, his voice calm but pointed. "Just to clarify, you personally did not see Jake Parker at the crime scene, correct?" Reynolds blinked. "No, I arrived after the fact." Noah nodded. "So, you're not testifying about what you saw. You're testifying about what someone else told you they saw." Reynolds hesitated. "That's correct." Noah turned to the jury, letting the answer sink in. "So, we have a claim. No physical proof. Just the word of one person." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The judge narrowed his eyes slightly, watching Noah carefully. Noah took another step closer. "And let's talk about that claim. You're basing your report on Mr. Roberts' statement. Did Mr. Roberts provide any additional evidence? Surveillance footage, for example?" Reynolds shifted in his seat. "There was security footage, yes." Noah tilted his head. "And did that footage clearly show Jake Parker?" Reynolds hesitated just a second too long. "The footage was unclear." That was it. Noah turned back to the judge. "Your Honor, we now have two key facts. First, the officer did not personally witness the crime. Second, the footage, the only objective piece of evidence, does not clearly identify my client." The jury was paying attention now. Noah could see it in their eyes, the way their skepticism was growing. He could feel the balance of power shifting. And then the prosecutor struck. With a slow, deliberate motion, he walked over to the evidence table and picked up a small plastic bag. Inside, A silver wristwatch gleamed under the fluorescent lights. The prosecutor turned toward the jury, lifting the bag higher. "This," he announced, "is Jake Parker's watch, and it was found near the back exit of Roberts Electronics, right where the suspect fled." A wave of whispers rippled through the room. Noah's stomach twisted. The prosecutor smirked. "Still think this is just a claim, Mr. Walker?" Noah's fingers tightened around the edge of the defense table as he stared at the watch inside the plastic evidence bag. His mind raced, calculating, dissecting, searching for an answer. Next to him, Jake shifted uneasily, leaning in to whisper, "Noah, that's my watch, but I lost it a week ago. I swear I haven't seen it since last Friday." Noah's breath hitched. "A week ago?" His pulse quickened as he turned back to the prosecutor, who was still holding up the bag like a trophy. "Your Honor," Noah said, stepping forward, his voice measured. "The prosecution claims this watch was found at the crime scene, but before we accept this as fact, I have a few questions." The judge gestured for him to proceed, though his expression remained unreadable. Noah turned to the prosecutor. "Tell me, when exactly was this watch discovered?" The prosecutor's smirk faltered, but only slightly. "During a secondary search of the crime scene." A flicker of something sharp passed through Noah's eyes. He took another step forward. "A second search?" He tilted his head. "Interesting. When was the first?" The prosecutor hesitated, then cleared his throat. "The night of the robbery." "And the watch wasn't found then?" "No." Noah let the answer hang in the air. A few jurors exchanged glances. "So, just to clarify," Noah continued, pacing slightly, "an initial search of the crime scene, the most thorough one, done immediately after the crime, did not uncover the watch. But then, later, suddenly, it appears." The prosecutor's jaw tensed. Noah turned back to the jury, his voice calm but firm. "And, Your Honor, if I may ask, where are the photos?" The judge blinked. "Photos?" "Yes," Noah said smoothly, walking to the evidence table. "Every piece of evidence collected from a crime scene is photographed in its original location before being bagged, logged, and submitted as evidence." He turned to the prosecutor, his eyes narrowing. "So where are the photos of this watch at the crime scene?" The prosecutor opened his mouth, then closed it. The courtroom murmurs grew louder. Noah pressed on. "If this watch was truly there, why wasn't it found in the first search? Why is there no photographic proof of it lying at the crime scene?" The prosecutor gritted his teeth. "Objection, Your Honor." But the judge raised a hand, silencing him. "Actually," the judge said, his voice slow, deliberate, "that's a fair question." A beat of silence. The prosecutor exhaled sharply, gripping the evidence bag a little too tightly. Noah didn't need to hear his answer to know the truth. This evidence was tainted, planted. And now, everyone in the courtroom was beginning to see it. The whispers in the crowd grew louder. The jury shifted in their seats. Even the judge seemed to lean back, rubbing his chin in thought. Noah had cracked something open, and the prosecution knew it. But just as he was gathering his notes, just as he was ready to breathe for the first time since stepping into this courtroom, a figure moved in the shadows at the back of the room. A man, tall, dressed in a dark suit, watching him. Noah felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise as the man approached, walking with slow, deliberate steps. He leaned down, just enough for only Noah to hear, and whispered, "Be careful, kid. Not everyone wants the truth to come out." Then, as quietly as he came, the man disappeared through the heavy wooden courtroom doors. And Noah suddenly felt like he was standing on the edge of something much bigger than just Jake's case. Noah sat at his desk long after midnight, his eyes burning from the glow of his laptop screen. Papers were scattered around him, court transcripts, security footage stills, notes scribbled in the margins. But his mind kept circling back to the same realization. They had been so focused on proving Jake's innocence that no one had stopped to ask the bigger question. If Jake didn't commit the robbery, then who did? The planted evidence, the missing security footage, the contradictions in testimonies, it all pointed to something deeper. Someone had gone to great lengths to make Jake look guilty, and Noah was going to find out who. By the time morning came, exhaustion clawed at his bones, but his resolve was sharper than ever. As he walked into the courtroom, he ignored the weight of the mysterious warning from the man in the dark suit. If someone was trying to scare him, they had picked the wrong person, because today he wasn't just defending Jake, he was going after the truth. The judge called the courtroom to order, and Noah stood, adjusting his tie as he turned toward the witness stand. "Your Honor," he said, his voice stronger than the day before, "I'd like to recall Mr. Roberts to the stand." A murmur swept through the room as the store owner hesitated before standing, his movements slower this time. He had walked into court yesterday with the confidence of a man who thought the system was on his side. But today, he looked uneasy. Noah watched him carefully as he was sworn in. Then, with deliberate steps, he approached the stand. "Mr. Roberts," Noah began, his tone polite but firm. "Yesterday you testified that you saw Jake Parker fleeing your store the night of the robbery. Is that correct?" Roberts nodded. "That's right." Noah held his gaze. "You're certain?" A brief hesitation. "Yes." Noah nodded as if he accepted the answer. Then, he turned to the evidence table, picking up a copy of the security footage stills. He placed them in front of Roberts. Then, "Can you describe exactly what the suspect was wearing?" Roberts exhaled sharply. "A hoodie. Dark. Maybe black." Noah's expression didn't change, but inside adrenaline surged. He turned to the jury, letting the moment breathe. "Black?" Noah repeated, feigning curiosity. "Yes," Roberts confirmed. "Black." Noah stepped forward, placing another sheet of paper on the stand. "This," he said, his voice calm, controlled, "is the official police report from the night of the robbery. It describes the suspect as wearing a dark blue hoodie." A ripple of whispers broke out. Robert's jaw tensed. Noah turned back to him. "So I'll ask again. Are you absolutely certain about what you saw?" Roberts's lips parted, but no sound came out. He glanced toward the prosecutor, who was suddenly looking very interested in the papers in front of him, as if trying to distance himself from the unfolding disaster. Noah didn't let up. "First, you claim Jake was the suspect. Now you're misidentifying the color of the hoodie, and yet you expect the court to believe your testimony is reliable?" The tension in the room was thick, every set of eyes fixed on the witness stand. Roberts clenched his fists, his face reddening. I might have been mistaken about the color, but I know what I saw." Noah arched an eyebrow. "Like how you knew about Jake's watch." Robert's breath hitched, and just like that, the noose tightened. Noah stepped back, pacing slightly as he let his words settle. Then he turned toward the judge. "Your Honor, yesterday, we questioned how the prosecution could present a piece of evidence, the defendant's wristwatch, when it was never photographed at the scene." He gestured toward the evidence table. "Today, we have our answer." He picked up a new report, a forensics analysis, and turned to the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the silence, "this is a report confirming that fingerprints were found on the evidence bag containing Jake's missing watch." He let the weight of that statement hang before he dropped the final blow. And those fingerprints don't belong to the police officers who collected the evidence. The tension was suffocating now. Noah turned, his eyes locking onto the witness stand. They belong, he said, his voice slow, deliberate, to Mr. Roberts. The courtroom exploded, gasps, shouting. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order. The jury members whispered frantically among themselves. Roberts had gone pale. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden railing of the witness stand. Noah took one final step forward. So, Mr. Roberts, can you explain why your fingerprints were found on a piece of evidence that was supposedly discovered by the police after the initial search? Roberts didn't answer. He couldn't. Noah watched as beads of sweat formed on the man's forehead. The weight of the room pressed down on him, the eyes of the jury, the judge, the audience, everyone waiting. Then, suddenly, Roberts bolted. It happened in an instant. 1 second, he was gripping the stand, and the next, he was lunging toward the back doors, shoving past startled reporters, his feet pounding against the marble floor. The entire courtroom erupted into chaos. "Stop him!" someone yelled. 2 uniformed officers sprang into action, racing after him. Chairs scraped against the ground as people turned, craning to watch the scene unfold. Noah stood frozen, his heart hammering as he watched the officers close in. Roberts made it halfway to the exit before a tackle sent him crashing to the ground, papers flying everywhere. The officers pinned him down, cuffing his wrists as he thrashed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Let me go!" he shouted. "You don't understand!" But no one was listening anymore, because in that moment, the case had changed forever. Jake Parker was no longer the accused, and Noah Walker had just blown open something much bigger than anyone had ever expected. The gavel struck the bench with a resounding crack, silencing the courtroom. The judge adjusted his glasses, glancing at the prosecutor before settling his gaze on Jake. "Mr. Parker," he announced, his voice firm, "you are hereby cleared of all charges. This court finds no credible evidence linking you to the robbery. You are free to go." A collective gasp swept through the audience, followed by an eruption of whispers. Jake exhaled sharply, his face a mix of disbelief and relief. His mother covered her mouth, tears welling in her eyes, while his father gripped his shoulder tightly. Noah felt the tension in his chest finally release. They had done it. He had done it. But something felt off. The case was over, yet a gnawing unease settled in Noah's gut. He had exposed Roberts as a liar, but that didn't explain everything. If Roberts had planted the watch, why? Who put him up to it? As the courtroom emptied, Noah gathered his papers, lost in thought. That's when he saw him. The man in the dark suit, standing near the exit, watching him. Noah froze, his pulse quickening. The man's presence wasn't an accident. He wasn't just another spectator. With slow, deliberate steps, the man approached, his gaze unwavering. Up close, he looked older than Noah had first thought. Late 40s, with sharp eyes and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing things other people didn't. He stopped just a foot away and extended his hand. "Daniel Rhodes," he said, his voice low but firm. "Criminal investigator." Noah hesitated before shaking it. "You were at the trial yesterday," he said, studying him. Rhodes gave a slight nod. "I was." Noah's grip tightened. "You told me to be careful. Why?" Rhodes exhaled and glanced around the emptying courtroom. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "Because this was never about just one case. The real criminals are still out there." A chill ran down Noah's spine. He had known something bigger was at play, but hearing it confirmed sent a wave of unease through him. "What do you mean?" Noah asked, his voice quieter now. Rhodes looked at him carefully, as if deciding how much to say. Then, with a small gesture, he motioned toward the hallway. Not here, he muttered. Walk with me. Noah glanced at Jake, who was still talking to his parents, then followed Rhodes out of the courtroom. They stepped into the dimly lit corridor, the sounds of the courthouse fading behind them. Rhodes walked slowly, his hands in his pockets. There's a reason this case felt off from the start, he began. False accusations, planted evidence, witnesses who suddenly remember things that never happened. He looked sideways at Noah. You ever wonder why someone went through all that trouble? Noah swallowed. To make Jake the scapegoat? Rhodes nodded. That's part of it, but here's the bigger picture. He stopped walking and faced Noah fully. This isn't the first time it's happened, and if someone doesn't stop it, it won't be the last. Noah's pulse pounded. What are you saying? I'm saying, Rhodes replied, his voice grave, that this robbery was never just a random crime. It was part of a pattern. Noah stared at him. There have been multiple cases like this, Rhodes continued. Same setup, small businesses hit, a random kid gets accused, and the real criminals walk free. Every time the evidence is just enough to convict, but when you dig deeper, nothing adds up. Noah's mind raced. So, this whole thing was staged? Rhodes nodded. Jake was just unlucky enough to be their fall guy. If you hadn't stepped in, he would have been another name in the system, another kid convicted for a crime he didn't commit. Noah felt his stomach churn, the weight of everything pressed down on him. The case had never been about Jake. It had been about the people pulling the strings behind the scenes. Noah inhaled sharply. Who's behind it? Rhodes hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, Philip Kane. Noah's body went rigid. The prosecutor? Rhodes gave a slow, deliberate nod. Kane isn't just a prosecutor. He's the one running this whole operation. He's been using his position to frame innocent people, cover up real crimes, and protect the ones actually responsible. Noah's mind reeled. But why? What does he get out of it? Rhodes sighed. Power, control, and most importantly, money. He rubbed his jaw. These robberies aren't just small-time hits, they're coordinated thefts. Electronics, valuables, expensive merchandise, all of it ends up being sold off. And Kane? He makes sure no one asks too many questions. Noah's hands clenched into fists. He had stood in that courtroom, face to face with Kane, not realizing the man in front of him was playing a much bigger game. And worse, he had just exposed that game. He looked at Rhodes, his voice quieter now. If this is true, then I'm in danger, aren't I? Rhodes gave a grim smile. Kid, you didn't just poke the hornet's nest, you took a bat to it. Noah exhaled slowly. Good, he muttered, surprising even himself. Rhodes narrowed his eyes. You're not scared? Noah thought about Jake, about how close his best friend had come to losing his future. He thought about every kid who hadn't been lucky enough to have someone fight for them. Then he met Rhodes's gaze, his jaw set. I'm tired of being scared, he said. Rhodes studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, kid, he said. Then let's take this bastard down. Noah barely had time to process what Rhodes had told him before everything fell apart. That night, the air in his house was heavy with unease. His mother had already gone to bed, exhausted from the stress of the trial, but Noah sat awake, staring at the ceiling. His mind spun with everything he had learned. Kane, the false convictions, the stolen goods. He had uncovered the truth. And now, they knew it. A sudden boom shattered the silence. The entire house shook. The windows rattled, and the lights flickered. Noah bolted upright, his heart hammering. Then, another explosion. This time, closer. Glass shattered as a fiery blast tore through the kitchen, sending debris flying. His mother's scream rang through the house. Noah barely had time to react before gunfire erupted outside. He heard the roar of an engine, the screech of tires. Shadows moved beyond the shattered window. Then, a voice. "Noah, get down!" The front door exploded inward as masked men poured in, their weapons drawn. Noah dove behind the couch, his ears ringing. Footsteps pounded against the floor. And then, gunshots. A figure crashed through the back window, rolling across the floor before coming up firing. One of the masked intruders dropped instantly. Rhodes. He grabbed Noah by the collar, dragging him toward the hallway. "Move!" he shouted over the chaos. Noah's mother stood at the top of the stairs, frozen in fear. Rhodes turned, his expression sharp. "Ma'am, we need to go, now." Before she could move, another masked figure rushed forward. Rhodes didn't hesitate. He spun, firing once, and the attacker crumpled to the ground. Suddenly, headlights flooded the front yard. An armored SUV skidded to a stop, and a woman in a dark tactical vest stepped out, her sidearm raised. "Agent Taylor." "Get in the car," she barked. Noah grabbed his mother's hand, running for the door as bullets whizzed past. Rhodes and Taylor covered them, returning fire as they sprinted to the SUV. The second the doors slammed shut, Taylor threw the vehicle into reverse, tires screaming against the pavement. Noah's breath was ragged. His mother was shaking. "What?" she gasped. "What is happening?" Rhodes reloaded his gun, his jaw clenched. "Kane just sent a message," he said darkly. "He knows we're getting close." Taylor sped through the empty streets, cutting through back alleys and side roads. "We can't go home," she said. "They'll be watching." Rhodes nodded. "I know a place." Within minutes, they reached an abandoned warehouse, hidden deep within the industrial district. The SUV skidded to a stop, and Taylor and Rhodes jumped out, sweeping the perimeter before motioning for Noah and his mother to follow. Inside, the place was dark, filled with dusty crates and rusted metal shelves. But in the back, behind an old workbench, was something different: a laptop, a radio, and stacks of files. Rhodes motioned for Noah to sit. "We don't have much time. If we're right, the evidence we need is in here." Taylor pulled a hard drive from her bag and plugged it into the laptop. A video file popped up on the screen. Noah's breath caught. It was Kane, sitting in a dimly lit office, speaking in a hushed voice to someone just out of frame. "You get rid of the kid yet?" Kane muttered. A distorted voice responded, "Not yet." Kane's face darkened. "Handle it. I don't care what you have to do. Just make sure he's gone before morning." Noah swallowed hard. Taylor sat back, exhaling. "This is it," she said. "This is what we need." Before they could react, a metallic click echoed through the warehouse, a gun being cocked. "That's enough." Noah turned slowly. Standing in the doorway, flanked by a half-dozen armed men, was Philip Kane, and he was smiling. "You really don't know when to quit, do you, kid?" he said, stepping forward. Taylor's hand inched toward her weapon. Kane warned. "I'd think twice about that." He nodded toward his men, who raised their rifles. Noah's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Kane chuckled. "You really think you were gonna expose me? In my own city?" His smirk widened. "You're not walking out of here." A tense silence hung in the air. Then, Rhodes moved first. Gunfire exploded as he grabbed Noah and dived behind a crate. Bullets ripped through the wooden pallets, sending splinters flying. Taylor returned fire, taking down one of Kane's men before rolling behind a rusted metal beam. Noah clutched the hard drive to his chest. This was it. The only thing that could take Kane down. They couldn't lose it now. Kane's voice rang out through the chaos. "Kill them and burn the place down!" Noah's chest tightened. They were going to torch the warehouse. Rhodes reloaded, his jaw set. "Kid," he muttered, You hold on to that drive no matter what. Noah's hands trembled, but he nodded. Then, the distant sound of sirens, loud, getting closer. Kane's head snapped up. What? Taylor grinned. Oh, did I forget to mention? She pulled a radio from her vest. We called the cavalry. A second later, police floodlights burst through the warehouse windows. This is the FBI. Drop your weapons and surrender immediately. Kane spun, rage flashing across his face. Take them down! But it was too late. Officers poured in from every entrance, guns drawn. Kane's men scattered, some dropping their weapons, others running for the exits. Within seconds, they were tackled to the ground, handcuffed, shouting in protest. Noah barely registered it. His eyes were locked on Kane. The prosecutor stood frozen, his face pale. Then he ran. But he only made it a few steps before Rhodes tackled him, slamming him to the ground. Kane grunted, trying to fight back, but Rhodes twisted his arm behind his back, pinning him down. This is over, Rhodes growled. Kane struggled, his breath ragged. You have nothing? Taylor held up the hard drive, smirking. Actually, she said, we have everything. The officers pulled Kane to his feet, cuffing his wrists. The fight was gone from him now. He stared at Noah, his jaw clenched. You don't know what you've done, kid. He spat. Noah stepped forward, his hands still shaking, but his voice steady. Yeah, he said. I do. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the warehouse walls as Kane was shoved into the back of a police car. Noah exhaled. It was over. They had won. The sun was just beginning to rise as Noah stepped out of the police station, the crisp morning air cooling the sweat still clinging to his skin. The chaos of the last 24 hours felt surreal, like a fever dream that had somehow become his reality. Across the parking lot, Jake stood with his parents, their faces a mix of exhaustion and relief. The weight of the charges that had nearly destroyed his life was gone, lifted by the truth. Jake caught Noah's eye and grinned. Dude, you actually did it. Noah let out a breathless laugh, shaking his head. Yeah, we did. Jake's father stepped forward, gripping Noah's hand tightly. I don't know how we'll ever repay you. Noah shrugged. Just don't lose another watch. Jake laughed, shaking his head. Never again. Behind them, a few news crews had gathered, their cameras flashing, their reporters murmuring about the high school kid who had taken on a corrupt prosecutor and won. A figure stepped up beside Noah, Rhodes. The investigator crossed his arms, watching him. You know, kid, he said, you've got guts. Most people in your shoes would have backed down. Noah smirked. Yeah, well, I guess I don't know when to quit. Taylor joined them, flipping her badge between her fingers. You ever think about making this a full-time thing? Noah blinked. What? She smiled. You've got a sharp mind, a sense of justice. We could use people like you. Noah hesitated, the weight of her words settling over him. 2 weeks ago, the thought would have seemed ridiculous. But now, it didn't seem so impossible. Rhodes clapped a hand on his shoulder. Take some time, think about it. But if you ever want in... He slipped a small card into Noah's pocket. You know where to find us. Noah nodded, his mind still processing everything. As Taylor and Rhodes walked away, he exhaled, turning back toward his mother's car. She was waiting for him, her face still tight with worry, but filled with pride. That night, as Noah lay in his bed for the first time in what felt like forever, he stared at the ceiling, letting the silence wash over him. He had fought against a system designed to break people like him. He had stood up for his best friend when no one else would, and against all odds, he had won. For the first time in weeks, he closed his eyes, no longer afraid of what tomorrow would bring. because tonight, justice had finally been served. Noah's story may have ended, but the fight for justice never stops. If this story inspired you, if it made you question how many people might be wrongfully accused, then don't let it end here. Share this video. Spread the truth. Stand up for what's right. And if you want more stories like this, stories of courage, truth, and the fight for justice, make sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Because in a world where power can be abused, sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up and say, enough.